The morning Hetta Marsh refused Sir Aldous Prentice, the fire in the east parlour had gone out. No one had thought to tend it. The coal scuttle stood empty beside the grate, and the grey ash lay undisturbed as if the cold had settled in the night and simply decided to stay. Hetta noticed it the moment she entered the room and crossed to the grate with the small tongs, before she had even set down her account book. It was the sort of thing she did without thinking, the maintenance of small warmths, the prevention of small discomforts, the quiet management of a house whose mistress sat in the drawing-room receiving calls, and whose master had been in the churchyard at St. Crispin's these 9 years past. She was 28 years old, and she had been managing Marsh Hall for most of them, but that was later. Begin instead on a Tuesday in early October of 1831, when the horse chestnut at the lane end had gone the colour of old copper, and the first real bite of autumn was in the air off the northern fields. Hetta sat at the writing desk in the estate room and worked through the household accounts with a methodical patience that no one in the house particularly noticed or thanked her for. The estate room was a narrow room behind the kitchen passage, fitted with a single north-facing window and shelves of ledgers whose leather spines had darkened to the colour of strong tea. She had set a small fire herself that morning, carrying the coal from the passage store because the hall boy, Thomas, was down with a chest ailment, and Mrs. Dorset, who managed everything that Hetta did not manage herself, had enough to attend to. The figures that morning told a familiar story. Marsh Hall's income from the home farm had declined for the third successive autumn. The tenant at the upper fields, a steady man named Groom, had given notice at midsummer that the drainage ditch along the north boundary required relaying, and the estimate for that work came to £14. £14 that the current quarterly accounts could not absorb without shortfall. Hetta had written 3 careful letters on the subject, one to a cousin who had some knowledge of agricultural drainage, and 2 to tradesmen in the village. She had received 2 replies, neither of them helpful. She set down the pen and looked at the north window. The garden wall beyond it was grey limestone, old and sound, covered in places with the last brown remnants of a climbing rose that needed cutting back before the frost made the work brutal. She had noted it on her list. The list was long. It was not that Hetta pitied herself. She had arrived at 28 through a series of seasons in which her mother, Lady Marsh, had arranged the introduction of 7 gentlemen of varying prospects and declining quality, and in which Hetta had, each time, conducted herself with plain courtesy and reached the end of each acquaintance with the quiet certainty that marriage to that particular man would require her to perform a version of herself she did not recognize. She had said so once to her mother, in the simplest terms she could find, and Lady Marsh had looked at her across the breakfast table with an expression of pure bafflement, as if a vase had addressed her. "A version of yourself," her mother had repeated in the tone she reserved for ideas she found both foreign and mildly offensive. "Henrietta, you are a woman of 28, with a moderate complexion and no fortune to speak of. You do not have the luxury of versions." That had been 6 months ago, in the spring. By October, Lady Marsh had moved beyond discussion. Mrs. Dorset knew because Mrs. Dorset knew everything that happened within 50 yards of Marsh Hall's 4 walls. She was a compact woman of 63, with a face that had settled into a permanent expression of precise and unsentimental attention, and she had served the Marsh household since Hetta's father was alive. She said little about Lady Marsh's manoeuvring, but she had a way of placing a cup of tea at Hetta's elbow at exactly the right moment that communicated more than words. And when she passed Hetta in the kitchen passage on the Tuesday morning in question, she let her gaze rest on the girl for 1 beat longer than necessary. "There is a stranger in the village," she said, as if reporting on the weather. "Staying at the White Hart. He came in on Friday with a surveying rod and a hired horse, and has been walking the North Field since Saturday morning." "A surveying rod," Hetta said. "And a hired horse," Mrs. Dorset said again with the same flat precision, and went about her business. Hetta did not think about the surveying stranger again until Wednesday, when she walked into Renwick Village to return 2 volumes to the lending library run by old Mr. Foss from the back room of his stationer's shop. The library was a single long room that smelled of paper and linseed oil, and the particular cold of stone floors that the small coal stove at the far end never quite overcame. Mr. Foss sat behind his counter at the near end and nodded when Hetta placed the volumes on the wooden return shelf. She had been a patron for 11 years. There was another person in the library. He was standing at the geography shelf, which ran along the east wall under the narrow windows, with a volume open in his hands. He was perhaps 35, tall enough that he had to angle his head slightly for the window light to fall on the page, and dressed in a coat that was practical rather than elegant, a good wool, she noticed, of a quality that sat oddly against his claim to be a plain farmer from the north. She did not know his claim at that moment. She only noticed the coat. He looked up when she came in. His eyes were grey and settled, the eyes of a man accustomed to being looked at and equally accustomed to giving nothing away. Hetta crossed to the farming and natural history section, which was in the far corner past the geography shelf, and drew out a slim volume on soil drainage in northern counties that she had been meaning to consult about the ditch problem. She read standing, because the single chair in the library was occupied by the volume the stranger had set down on it when he moved to the geography shelf, and she had no particular desire to call attention to the oversight. After a moment, the stranger glanced over. He saw the displaced chair. He lifted the volume, held it at his side, and said, "Forgive me, please sit." "I am quite comfortable standing," Hetta said. "So am I," he said, and set the volume on the geography shelf and returned to his reading. It was a very small exchange. It had no weight at the time. She found 3 useful pages on drainage technique and memorized the relevant figures before she set the volume back. When she passed the geography shelf on her way to the door, she noticed that the volume he held was a county atlas, open to the survey maps of the northern parishes, and that he was reading it with the same close attention she had given to the drainage manual. He did not look up when she passed, but as she put her hand to the door latch, he said, without turning his head, "The second drainage method described in that volume, on page 41, it is the correct one for clay soil. The first method is only effective in sand." Hetta turned. He was still looking at the atlas. "You have read it," she said. "I have used it," he said. She thanked him. She went out. She did not know his name. His name, as he had given it at the White Hart, was Edward Colling. He had arrived 3 weeks ago, he told the innkeeper, to survey parcels of land in the northern parishes on behalf of a consortium of agricultural interests from Northumberland. He was quiet, prompt with his bills, and ate his supper in the main room without ostentation. The innkeeper's wife thought him pleasant. The innkeeper thought him thorough. Neither of them thought him particularly remarkable, which was, in its own way, a considerable achievement. The morning after the library, Hetta was in the kitchen garden, cutting back the climbing rose from the east-facing wall with a pair of long-handled shears that had belonged to her father. The work required concentration and a degree of brute patience, because the old canes were thick and the thorns had hooked themselves through the stone crevices over the summer. She had been at it for perhaps half an hour when she became aware that someone had stopped at the garden gate in the low wall that separated the kitchen garden from the lane running down to the home farm. It was the man from the library. He was carrying the surveying rod Mrs. Dorset had mentioned, a long wooden pole with brass fittings, and he had a leather case slung over one shoulder. He looked at her for a moment with that same settled attention. "The lane through to the north field," he said. "Does it run past this garden, or round the far side of the wall?" "Round the far side," Hetta said, and pointed. "Through the gate at the end of the kitchen passage, and left along the hazel hedge. It will bring you to the north boundary in perhaps 10 minutes. He nodded. He began to move away, and then he stopped and looked at the rose canes she had been cutting, and at the pile accumulating on the path. "The old canes want taking right back to the second bud from the wall," he said. "If you leave more than that, they will put all their strength into the old wood come spring and give you very little flower." Hetta looked at the canes. She looked at him. "I know," she said evenly. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "Of course," he said, and went on down the lane. Over the next 10 days, she encountered him 4 times on the estate grounds and once more in the village. Each occasion was brief, and each one was grounded in some specific and practical subject: the drainage work, the condition of the Northfield's boundary stones, the particular variety of apple tree espaliered against the south wall of the kitchen garden. He did not call upon the house. He did not send a card. He did not, in any of the recognizable forms of Regency social procedure, make any claim on her attention at all. He simply appeared where the work of surveying took him, and when they spoke it was in the plain register of people discussing practical things. And she found, without particularly examining the finding, that she had begun to look forward to it. Mrs. Dorset noticed. She said nothing. She placed the tea at Hetta's elbow, and once, when Hetta came in from the garden with a smear of rosebark on her cuff and a look on her face that Mrs. Dorset did not comment upon, the housekeeper said only, "The surveying gentleman has been on the North Fields again this morning. He asked Thomas, when Thomas was well enough to be about, whether the hall had a library." "What did Thomas say?" Hetta asked. "That it did, that it was the best room in the house." Mrs. Dorset picked up her basket. "Thomas has no reason to be wrong about that." The hall library was on the first floor, at the north end, with 3 tall windows that in summer faced the beech trees and in October faced the bare sky and the grey line of the northern hills. It was a room that had been Hetta's particular province since her father's time. The collection ran to perhaps 400 volumes, including a solid run of agricultural and surveying texts that her father had assembled with a farmer's practical bent, alongside the novels and histories that Hetta had added with her own book money over the years. The fire in the library was the one fire in the house that Hetta always lit herself. She did not, in the days that followed, invite the surveying stranger to the library. She mentioned its existence to no one. She noted, once in passing, that the agricultural section included 2 county atlases that might be useful for cross-referencing the Northfield survey, and she said so in the matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, because it was true and because it seemed wasteful not to say it. He came on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the first hard frost had gone through the garden, and the beech trees in the north view had shed to their last quarter of leaves. Mrs. Dorset brought him up from the hall and left him at the library door with the composed expression of a woman who had made her own assessment and found nothing to object to. He spent 2 hours in the library. Hetta worked at the writing desk in the east corner, and he worked at the long reading table under the middle window, and they exchanged perhaps 40 words, most of them about agricultural practice. At the end of 2 hours he closed the atlas, set it back on its shelf with the same precision with which he did everything, and said, "Miss Marsh, I am obliged to you." "It is a good collection," she said. "My father knew what he was buying." "He had good judgment," the stranger said, and Hetta thought he meant the books, and then she was not certain he had meant only the books, and then he was gone, and she sat for a moment with her pen motionless above the page. It was at the end of that same week that Lady Marsh summoned her to the drawing room. The drawing room at Marsh Hall was a room that expressed its mistress very precisely. It was furnished in the style of 15 years ago, with the determined confidence of a woman who had decided that her tastes were correct and required no updating. The chairs were good walnut, the fire was large, and the mantelpiece carried a collection of china figures that Hetta had always found slightly plaintive in their painted fixity. Lady Marsh sat in the largest chair with the embroidery in her lap that she carried everywhere and rarely advanced. "Sir Aldous Prentice is coming to dine on Friday," Lady Marsh said. Not a question, not a discussion. Hetta stood near the window. "You have written to him," she said. "Naturally, I have written to him. He is an excellent man of steady income and good family, and he has expressed a very warm interest in this household." Lady Marsh set down the embroidery frame with a small, decisive click against the side table. "Henrietta, you are 28 years old. I will be direct with you. Sir Aldous is willing to make an offer. I have given him every encouragement to do so." "Have you?" Hetta said. "This is not a criticism of your character. It is a statement of your situation. The county has exhausted its patience with your delays, and frankly, so have I." "I have not delayed," Hetta said with perfect calm. "I have declined." "A distinction that matters to no one but yourself," her mother said, and picked up the embroidery frame again, which was her way of indicating that a conversation had reached its conclusion. Sir Aldous arrived on Friday. He was a man of perhaps 50, broad in the chest, with the blustering confidence of someone who had been given what he wanted, often enough to mistake it for a natural law. He spoke at length about his property near Harlow, about the improvements he had made to his north wing, and about his views on estate management, which were numerous and none of them invited. He addressed most of these remarks to Lady Marsh and used the word handsome in reference to Hetta 3 times during the meal in a way that made her think of an assessment rather than a compliment. She was civil to him. She was civil to everyone. She answered his questions directly and asked him, out of genuine curiosity, about the drainage system on his North Acres. And he answered with the surprised gratification of a man who had not expected to be asked a practical question by a woman at dinner. When the evening ended and Hetta was on the stairs with her candle, she heard her mother say, in the drawing room below, in the carrying voice that she used when she assumed the house was empty of attending ears, "She is sensible enough when she chooses to be. And she has passed the point of expecting anything better." Hetta went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time and did not sleep. In the library, the following Thursday, working through the November household accounts while the beech trees stood bare against a white sky, she heard something that she was not meant to hear. She had not been aware that Lady Marsh was in the corridor outside the library door. She had not been aware that Sir Aldous was at the hall that morning at all, because no visit had been announced and no carriage had been heard in the drive. She learned later that he had come through the garden gate from the lane, the same lane the surveying stranger used when he walked down to the North Fields, and that Lady Marsh had met him in the corridor outside the estate room, and they had moved to the corridor outside the library, which was quieter. The library door was not fully closed. It had a habit of drifting open if the latch was not pressed firmly home, and Hetta had not pressed it firmly because she had not thought it necessary. She heard her mother's voice first, low and quick and without the drawing-room performance in it. "It is settled. The document is drawn. I signed it in my capacity as her mother and as the remaining authority over this household's affairs. Mr. Gresham, our solicitor, has a copy." A pause. Then Sir Aldous, with his dinner-table bluster stripped back to something more transactional. "And she will be informed when?" "When it is too late to be useful for her to object," Lady Marsh said. She is clever, but she is not clever in the way that produces legal remedies. She will comply. She has no alternative that she can actually execute. Hetta set down her pen. She was very still. The assembly, Sir Aldous said. Late November, we can make the announcement there before the county. By then, the winter term will have begun, and any period of objection will have passed without consequence. That is precisely what I intend, her mother said. The footsteps moved away down the corridor. The silence closed back in around the library. The north window showed the bare hills, and the grey sky, and the rose cut back to its second bud from the wall, exactly as she had been told, and the drainage ditch running along the north boundary that still needed relaying, and all the ordinary inventory of a world in which she had been arranged, in the corridor outside the room where she was sitting, like furniture. She sat at the desk for perhaps 10 minutes. The fire in the library had burned down to red coals. She did not move to build it up. Mrs. Dorset came with tea at 11:30, as she always did, and found Hetta at the desk with the account book closed and her hands flat on the leather cover, and an expression on her face that Mrs. Dorset had not seen there before, or not quite in that form. The ditch will need to wait, Hetta said. I have a different problem. Mrs. Dorset poured the tea. She set the cup at Hetta's elbow. She said, I know, and left it at that. And Hetta, who had no one else in the world she would have trusted with this particular hour, felt the plainness of those two words as a thing of genuine worth. It was 3 days later that the surveying stranger came to the library for the second time. Hetta had not sought him out. She had not sent word to the White Hart or crossed his path on the estate grounds. She had gone about the household work, answered the correspondence, managed the estate room, and met her mother at meals with the same plain, level courtesy that had always been her register, because she did not know what else to do yet, and because she understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had grown up inside a constrained world and learned to think within it, that visible distress was not an instrument. It only made other people comfortable. He arrived at the library door in the early afternoon. Mrs. Dorset had let him in again with the same composed expression, and he stood in the doorway with the leather case over one shoulder and looked at Hetta for a moment before he said anything. She was standing at the north window. She had been standing there for some time, looking at the bare hills. I will not disturb you, he said, if this is not a good afternoon. You are not disturbing me, she said. She turned from the window. The atlases are on the same shelf. He came in. He set the case down and took the county atlas from its place on the shelf, but he did not sit down at the reading table. He stood with it in his hands for a moment, and then he looked at her again, and there was something in his expression that was different from the settled opacity of the earlier occasions, something that was less sealed. You are not quite yourself this afternoon, he said plainly. It was not an intrusive observation. It was a plain fact, stated without agenda in the same register he used for drainage methods and rose canes, and she found it more difficult to deflect than any more elaborate form of concern would have been. I have had some news, she said, and kept her voice level. He waited. He did not press. He simply remained present, holding the atlas, giving her the option of saying more or not, without making either choice a matter of performance. She told him, briefly and without drama, about the document. The betrothal signed in her name by a mother who had calculated that compliance was easier to engineer after the fact than before. She did not elaborate on the particulars of her own distress. She stated the situation as she had found it, because she was not a woman who dressed facts in feeling when speaking to someone whose opinion she was not certain she had. He was very still while she spoke. When she finished, he said, What will you do? I do not yet know what I can do, she said, but I know what I will not do. She moved to the writing desk and sat down and opened the account book to the correct page. "I will not comply," she said simply. "I will refuse him, publicly if necessary, and before the assembly if that is when it is meant to be announced." He looked at her for a long moment. He said nothing. He took the atlas to the reading table and opened it and began to work, and the library settled back into its afternoon quiet, and the coals in the fire gave off a steady warmth, and neither of them spoke again for a long time. But the silence had a different quality now, something shared rather than merely shared space. The winter assembly was to be held at Ashmore House, the largest private residence in the county, whose owner, Sir Raymond Calloway, was a man of substantial local consequence and the host of the season's principal social event. This Hetta knew in the ordinary way of county knowledge, through the invitation that had sat on the hall table for a fortnight. She also knew because Lady Marsh had told her that the announcement of the betrothal was intended for the assembly floor, before the full county, because Lady Marsh understood perfectly well that public announcement was the most effective form of coercion. The assembly was on a Friday in late November, 6 weeks after the surveying stranger had arrived in Renwick, and the day before it, Hetta met Sir Aldous in the entrance hall of Marsh Hall, and refused him. She had not planned the timing. She had come down the main stair to find him standing in the hall with his hat in his hands and his coat dusted with the first light snow that had begun to fall that morning, and her mother standing in the morning-room doorway with an expression of fixed brightness that Hetta recognized as the expression she wore when she wanted the situation to appear comfortable and was prepared to insist on that. "Sir Aldous," Hetta said from the third stair where she stopped, "I must speak plainly with you." Lady Marsh said, "Henrietta, this is not the moment for—" But Hetta had already continued. "I have been made aware of a document purporting to commit me to a marriage arrangement that I did not agree to and was not consulted about. I do not accept that document as a binding expression of my wishes. I will not marry you, Sir Aldous. I wish you no ill, and I say this with all the courtesy I can manage. But I will not." Sir Aldous stared at her. His face moved through surprise and arrived at indignation by approximately the second sentence, and by the end he was very red and drawing in a breath to respond, and Lady Marsh was saying his name in a desperate, soothing register. "The document," he began. "Is your matter and my mother's," Hetta said from the stair with her hands quiet at her sides. "It is not mine." She came down the last 2 stairs and went past him toward the kitchen passage, and her heart was striking the inside of her chest with a regularity that suggested it was working considerably harder than her face was communicating. Mrs. Dorset was in the passage. She handed Hetta a cup of tea without a word, and stood beside her while the raised voices in the entrance hall made their way through the door, and then subsided. "Well done," Mrs. Dorset said into the quiet. The winter assembly at Ashmore House drew near 80 people from the county's principal households, which was about what it always drew. The rooms were well lit and warm, and the musicians in the upper gallery played tolerably. Hetta wore her best grey silk, which was 2 seasons old but well cut, and she arrived with her mother, who had barely spoken to her since the previous afternoon, and maintained a rigid social brightness through the carriage journey that was exhausting to witness. Sir Aldous was there. He stood with 2 men near the punch table and looked at Hetta with the blotchy displeasure of a man reconsidering his losses. She looked back at him without expression and moved on. Edmund Colling was there. She saw him across the room within the first quarter hour, standing near the windows that looked out over the south terrace, talking with a man she did not recognize, a compact older gentleman with a silver watch chain and the bearing of a senior servant or a confidential secretary. He was dressed well tonight, better than the practical coat of the estate grounds, in a dark coat of the sort that required a tailor who understood proportion. And he looked, in this room, in this light, in the way he stood, like a man entirely in his own space. She registered the change without identifying its full weight and moved on to speak with a neighbour she had known since childhood. It was perhaps 40 minutes into the evening when she heard it. The man with the silver watch chain had crossed to the far end of the room, where a small group had formed around an introduced acquaintance from the northern counties, and Hetta was near enough to the group, having stopped to speak with the wife of the local magistrate, to hear the exchange that followed. The man with the watch chain said, in a low but carrying voice to a woman at the group's edge, "Lord Calloway's cousin from Northumberland. They have been expecting him this season. My lord has been quietly surveying the Ashmore northern parcels, I believe, before the question of the entail is finally settled." Hetta was still talking to the magistrate's wife, who was saying something about the musicians, and Hetta answered correctly because the answer required no thought, but her attention had gone entirely to the man with the watch chain and to the phrase that was still arranging itself in her understanding. My lord. She looked across the room to where Edmund Colling stood. He was looking at her, not with calculation, not with the expression of someone who had been caught, but with the direct, settled attention she had come to recognize as simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. The older gentleman crossed back to his side and said something, and the group nearest Hetta turned, because the group always turned when a new social fact entered the room, and someone at the edge of the group, a tall woman in amber, who Hetta knew as Mrs. Farley from the north side of the county, said clearly, "But that is Lord Ashmore's nephew, is it not? The Earl of Ashmore. I met him at my sister's in York not 3 years ago." The room did not stop. Rooms do not stop. The musicians kept playing and the candles kept burning, and the punch table bore its usual cluster of gentlemen. It was only that a new understanding moved through the gathering, the way cold moves through an opened door, not dramatically but certainly, touching everything it passed. The Earl of Ashmore. Edmund Colling, who had taken lodgings at the White Hart and walked the North Fields with a surveying rod, who had told her the correct method for cutting rose canes and offered her a chair in the lending library, and sat quietly in her father's library, while she told him about the worst thing her mother had done. Lady Marsh was standing 12 feet away. Hetta watched her mother's face. She watched the moment the name landed, the moment the social arithmetic rearranged itself, with a speed that was almost audible, the moment Lady Marsh looked at the man she had seen entering the hall library twice on what she had considered inconvenient business, the man she had perhaps registered vaguely as a respectable nobody from the north, and understood, in front of the assembled county, who he was. Sir Aldous, 6 feet further along the room, had gone the colour of cold dough. Edmund moved through the room toward Hetta with the direct, unhurried bearing of a man who had been walking toward something for longer than the last 10 minutes. The crowd adjusted around him without his asking, in the instinctive way crowds adjust around their betters, and he arrived at her side and looked at her for a moment, and said, at a pitch suited to the two of them only, "I should have told you sooner. I am sorry for it." "Were you surveying land?" she said, and kept her voice steady. "Or something else?" "Both," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Sir Raymond is my mother's brother. The northern parcels have a genuine question of entail attached to them. I was not inventing the surveying." A pause. "I was not inventing anything else, either." "Mr. Colling is not your name," she said. "Edmund Calloway," he said. "Edward Colling was the name on a surveying licence I obtained for a previous project. I am afraid the innkeeper at the White Hart now requires a good deal of explanation." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile and was warmer than amusement. She looked at him. She was thinking about the lending library, and the county atlas, and the rose canes, and the library at Marsh Hall, with the 400 volumes and the north window and the afternoon she had told him about the document, while he held an atlas and gave her room. "You knew," she said, "when I told you about the arrangement, the document." "I knew," he said. She considered that. "And you said nothing. You did nothing." "You had not asked me to," he said with perfect simplicity. The magistrate's wife had drifted close enough to be hearing this. Mrs. Farley in amber had turned from her own conversation. Hetta was aware of it and did not adjust. "I refused him," she said. "Yesterday, before I knew any of this." The settled look in his eyes had something added to it now. "I know," he said. "Mrs. Dorset sent a note to the White Hart." Hetta stood for a moment with that knowledge. Mrs. Dorset, who had said, "I know," 2 words at a time and placed tea at elbows, and assessed the quality of visiting strangers' coats with the precision of a woman who had been watching the hall for 30 years. Miss Dorset, who had told her about the surveying rod on a Tuesday morning, with the air of someone mentioning the weather. "She did not tell me," Hetta said. "She thought you would prefer to do what you were going to do without the weight of a consequence on it," he said. I agreed with her. Across the room, Lady Marsh was navigating toward them with the fixed purpose of a woman who had recalculated her position and intended to arrive at it before anyone else could establish the terms. Hetta saw her coming. She did not move. Lady Marsh arrived at her daughter's side and looked at the man standing next to her with an expression that was performing warmth over a structure of sheer hard effort. "My lord," she said. The title came out with a careful brightness. "Lady Marsh," he said with courteous flatness. Her mother looked at him and then at Hetta, and in her face was the unmistakable passage of a woman who had managed a household and a social campaign for 30 years, reaching the end of what her instruments could accomplish. The document was in Mr. Gresham's office. Sir Aldous was standing by the punch table, looking as though he wished the room had a second exit. The county was watching with the collective attentiveness of people who had come out on a cold November night, hoping for music and food, and receiving instead a considerably better story. "Henrietta," her mother said, and stopped. There was nothing available to follow it. "Yes, Mamma," Hetta said, and nothing else. Lady Marsh made a small, insufficient gesture with her hand, the gesture of someone reaching for an instrument and finding the case empty, and then she withdrew back toward the chairs along the wall with the dignity she could manage, which was considerable because she was a woman of formidable training. She sat down. She arranged her expression. She would not collapse because she was not capable of collapse. She would reconstruct. But the reconstruction would have to account for what everyone in the room had seen, and the version of Henrietta Marsh she had been working from for 28 years was not going to serve her as well as it once had. Sir Aldous left early. His departure was noticed, because departures are noticed when they are made while the evening is still young, and the supper not yet laid, and the county drew its conclusions with the quiet efficiency of people who had been drawing conclusions about one another's business for generations. Hetta stood in the warm room until supper, and spoke to the people she knew, and heard the musicians finish their last measure before the interval, and was aware, across the evening, of Edmund Calloway moving through the room with the ease of a man in his own world, which it was more literally than she had known. He spoke with Sir Raymond. He spoke with the magistrate's wife. Once, across a distance of perhaps 20 feet, he looked at Hetta, and she looked back, and there was nothing to perform in either direction, which was, she thought, the most comfortable she had been in a drawing-room in recent memory. The carriage back to Marsh Hall was very quiet. Lady Marsh stared at the dark fields passing the window and said nothing for the whole of the 40 minutes. Hetta watched the snow, which had thickened since morning, lying in pale strips along the hedgerows, and felt the particular exhaustion of a day that had required a great deal of her and had also, somewhere inside its difficulty, given her something back. In the morning, the garden was under its first proper frost. The ground was stiff and the rose canes stood silver in the early light, cut back to their second bud from the wall exactly as they should be, and the drainage ditch at the north boundary was outlined in ice along its edges, a problem still requiring its 14 pounds and its solution, but a problem that was hers to manage, and always had been, and she had always known how. She came out through the kitchen passage door with her shawl around her shoulders and stood in the kitchen garden where the last of the autumn's herbs had gone to brown stalks in the beds, and the apple tree on the south wall held its bare branches in a wide, careful shape against the grey stone. Mrs. Dorset appeared at the passage door with a cup of tea. She crossed the garden and held it out. "He called at the hall this morning," she said. "Early, before you were down." Hetta took the cup. "What did he say?" "That he would come again this afternoon if you were willing." Mrs. Dorset paused. "That he hoped you were well. That the drainage problem on the north boundary has a solution he had identified in the survey, and he wished to discuss it with you at your convenience." She let a brief silence sit. "In that order." Hetta looked at the north wall where the ditch ran along the boundary under its rime of ice. "The drainage solution," she said. "First," Mrs. Dorset said, and the small sound she made was as close to satisfaction as her face generally permitted. Hetta stood in the kitchen garden in the frost with her tea, in the particular stillness of a morning that had not yet decided what it would become. And the rose canes held their careful winter shape beside her, and the gate at the lane end was grey wood and old iron, and the north fields beyond it were white and quiet, and the whole of it was hers. The accounts she managed and the library she tended and the garden she had cut back to its proper growth with her father's shears, and she stood in it without apology, belonging there as she had always belonged, and waited for the afternoon.